I showed up at my grandparents' house for Thanksgiving only to find my entitled brother had forced them into the basement. It was his biggest mistake and completely ruined his life. I took everything from him, just like he did to them, and never looked back. I, 28M, never thought I'd be the type of person to destroy someone's life. But sometimes family pushes you to places you never imagined you'd go. Last Thanksgiving changed everything. I'd been working overseas for the past 3 years, sending money home to help my grandparents with their medical bills and house maintenance. They raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and my older brother was 16. While I was grateful for everything they'd done, my brother seemed to think their sacrifices were just what he was owed. I hadn't been home in 2 years, but I'd been planning this surprise visit for months. I wanted to see their faces when I walked through the front door of the house where I'd grown up, the same Victorian home my grandfather had inherited from his father. I'd even bought plane tickets for them to visit me in Germany the following spring. When I pulled into the driveway that Thursday afternoon, something felt wrong immediately. The house looked different, newer cars in the driveway, expensive ones I didn't recognize. The front yard had been completely redone with modern landscaping that looked nothing like the garden my grandmother had tended for 40 years. I knocked on the front door, expecting to surprise them, but a woman I'd never seen before answered. She looked annoyed when I asked for my grandparents, telling me they lived in the basement now and that I should use the side entrance. My blood went cold. The side entrance led to what used to be the basement, but it had been converted into a cramped apartment. The ceiling was low, the windows were tiny, and the whole space felt damp and dark. When I found my grandparents down there, I barely recognized them. My grandfather, who used to be this robust man who built furniture in his spare time, looked frail and defeated. My grandmother was sitting in a corner, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. They were shocked to see me, and the joy in their eyes quickly turned to embarrassment. My grandmother started crying, telling me they were sorry I had to see them like this. My grandfather explained what had happened with a voice that shook with humiliation. My brother had moved back home 2 years ago after his business failed. He'd convinced them to let him help by taking over the house management. Gradually, he'd moved his girlfriend and her 2 kids in, claiming it was temporary. Then he'd suggested my grandparents would be more comfortable in the basement, where it was quieter and they wouldn't have to deal with stairs. He'd promised it was just until they figured out a better arrangement. But there was no better arrangement coming. My brother had been collecting their Social Security checks, claiming he was managing their finances. He'd convinced them to sign papers that gave him power of attorney, telling them it would make things easier for everyone. The basement conversion had been done with their money, but for his convenience, not their comfort. I spent that evening with them in their cramped space, listening to how my brother would bring them meals when he remembered, how they weren't allowed in the main house when his girlfriend's friends came over, how they'd been told they were too old to understand modern finances, so he'd handle everything. My grandmother whispered that she missed her kitchen, missed cooking for family gatherings. She told me how my brother had sold most of their furniture, claiming they didn't need it anymore since they had less space. My grandfather mentioned that his workshop tools were gone too, sold to help with expenses. I stayed in a hotel that night, my mind racing. I'd sent thousands of dollars over the years, money I thought was helping them maintain their independence and dignity. Instead, it had probably funded my brother's lifestyle while he systematically stripped them of everything they'd worked for. The next morning, I went back to the house and found my brother in what used to be my grandfather's study, now converted into his home office. He seemed genuinely surprised to see me, but quickly shifted into his usual charming mode, acting like everything was perfectly normal. He explained how much easier it was for our grandparents to live downstairs, how he was taking such good care of them, how I shouldn't worry about anything because he had everything under control. When I asked about the power of attorney and their finances, he became defensive. He told me I'd been gone for years and didn't understand the situation. He claimed they were getting too old to handle things themselves, and that someone needed to step in. He made it sound like he was doing them a favor, like he was the responsible one while I was off living my life abroad. But I could see through it all. This wasn't about helping them. This was about taking advantage of them. My brother had always been selfish, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined he was capable of. I spent the weekend quietly gathering information. I took photos of their living conditions, documented everything they told me about the financial arrangements, and started making phone calls. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse, and what I learned made my stomach turn. Everything my brother had done was legal on paper, but it was textbook financial elder abuse. The power of attorney documents were legitimate, but they'd been obtained through manipulation and coercion. The living situation was technically adequate, but it was clearly designed to isolate and control them. The lawyer explained that proving abuse would be difficult and time-consuming, especially since my grandparents were afraid to speak against my brother. They'd become dependent on him and were terrified of what would happen if they caused trouble. But there were other options. I started with the financial investigation. My brother had been sloppy, probably because he never expected anyone to look closely at what he was doing. The money I'd been sending was supposed to go into their joint account, but he'd been redirecting it to accounts he controlled. He'd been using their credit cards for personal expenses, claiming everything was for household needs. More importantly, I discovered that he'd been planning to sell the house. He'd already had it appraised and was in preliminary discussions with a real estate agent. The plan was apparently to move our grandparents into a nursing home and pocket the proceeds from the sale. That's when I decided to destroy him. I started by contacting Adult Protective Services and filing a formal complaint. I provided all the documentation I'd gathered, including photos and financial records. I also reached out to my grandfather's old lawyer, who was horrified to learn what had happened and immediately began working to reverse the power of attorney. But I didn't stop there. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper into my brother's activities. What we found was even worse than I'd imagined. He'd been running up debt in my grandparents' names, had taken out a second mortgage on the house without their knowledge, and had been using their identities for various financial schemes. The investigator also discovered that my brother's girlfriend was involved. She'd been encouraging him to move faster on selling the house, and they'd already been looking at properties to buy with the proceeds. They'd planned this whole thing together. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report and submitted it to multiple agencies. Adult Protective Services opened an investigation. The state attorney general's office got involved because of the financial crimes. The IRS became interested when they learned about the unreported income and fraudulent tax filings. While the investigations were proceeding, I worked on the immediate situation. I found a lawyer who specialized in emergency guardianship cases and filed a petition to have my brother's power of attorney revoked. I also arranged for temporary housing for my grandparents, though convincing them to leave was the hardest part of everything. They were scared. My brother had convinced them that without him, they'd end up in a terrible nursing home or homeless. He'd made them believe they were a burden and that he was their only option. It took weeks of gentle conversations to help them understand that they had other choices. The breakthrough came when my grandmother finally admitted that she was afraid of my brother. She told me how he'd started getting angry when she asked questions about money, how he'd threatened to put them in a home if they didn't cooperate. She'd been walking on eggshells in her own house, terrified of making him mad. Once I had that admission, everything moved quickly. The emergency guardianship was granted, and I was able to move my grandparents out of the basement and into a beautiful assisted living community where they had their own apartment but access to help when they needed it. My brother's world started collapsing almost immediately. The financial investigation revealed the full extent of his fraud. He'd stolen over $200,000 from them over 2 years. The second mortgage he'd taken out was called in when the bank learned about the fraudulent application. His girlfriend left him when she realized he was about to face serious criminal charges. The house went into foreclosure, but I was able to work with the bank to resolve the situation. Since the second mortgage was fraudulent, it was voided, and I helped my grandparents sell the house properly. They used the proceeds to secure their future care and still had enough left over to live comfortably. My brother was arrested 6 months later. The charges included elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and forgery. His public defender tried to work out a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in being lenient. The case had attracted media attention as an example of family financial abuse, and they wanted to send a message. During the trial, my grandparents had to testify about what he'd done to them. Watching my grandfather, this proud man who'd worked his whole life to build something for his family, describe how his own grandson had stolen from him and forced him to live in a basement, was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced. My brother was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, his relationship, and any chance of inheriting anything from our grandparents. The judge also ordered him to pay full restitution, though we all knew he'd never be able to repay what he'd stolen. Update 1. It's been 3 years since the trial, and I wanted to share how things have turned out. My grandparents are thriving in their assisted living community. My grandmother has made friends and even started teaching cooking classes. My grandfather joined a woodworking group and has been making furniture again. They're happier than they've been in years. I moved back to the States permanently to be closer to them. I found a good job in the city where they live, and I visit them every week. We have family dinners again, and my grandmother cooks for me in the community kitchen. It's not the same as the old house, but it's better than what my brother had reduced them to. My brother was released early for good behavior after serving 5 years. He tried to contact me when he got out, claiming he wanted to make amends and asking for help getting back on his feet. I didn't respond. He also tried to visit our grandparents, but they refused to see him. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he's working at a warehouse and living in a studio apartment. He'll never be able to get credit again, and his criminal record makes it difficult for him to find decent employment. The restitution order follows him everywhere, and a portion of any wages he earns goes directly to our grandparents. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about destroying my brother's life so completely. The answer is no. He made his choices when he decided to abuse two elderly people who had given him everything. He could have asked for help, could have found legitimate ways to support himself, could have treated them with the respect they deserved. Instead, he chose to steal from them, humiliate them, and plan to abandon them in a nursing home while he profited from their life's work. He showed them no mercy, so I showed him none. Update 2. Last month marked the 4th anniversary of that Thanksgiving when I discovered what my brother had done. My grandparents are still doing well, though my grandfather's health has declined somewhat. He's 89 now, and my grandmother is 87. They're in the memory care section of their community now, but they're together and comfortable. I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. My grandparents built something meaningful with their lives. They raised 2 boys after tragedy struck. They maintained a home that was the center of family gatherings. They worked hard and saved money and tried to leave something behind for the next generation. My brother tried to steal that legacy for his own selfish purposes. He didn't just take their money. He took their dignity, their independence, and their sense of security. He made them feel like burdens in their own home. But in the end, their real legacy isn't the house or the money. It's the values they taught us, the love they showed us, and the example they set. I learned from them that family means protecting each other, not exploiting each other. I learned that doing the right thing sometimes requires difficult choices. My brother learned different lessons, apparently, but that was his choice to make. I don't regret anything I did. When I saw them living in that basement, diminished and afraid, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let their story end with them being victims of their own grandson's greed. They deserved better, and I made sure they got it. The revenge wasn't just about punishing my brother. It was about restoring justice for 2 people who had given everything to their family and deserved to live their final years with dignity and peace. That's exactly what they're doing now, and that's the only outcome that matters to me.